Thank you, and thank you for JNF-USA for hosting this. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I was asked to address the question of Zionism, and especially the question of Zionism on campus. So I want to start by a small anecdote. About 2 years ago, I taught a course at Georgetown University as a visiting professor on Zionism and anti-Zionism. At the end of the course, one of my Jewish students came up to me and she said that this course was more valuable to her than dozens of hours of therapy. And this has led me on a journey to understand the way that anti-Zionism and Zionism are experienced on campus by students. And what I realized is that a certain dynamic was at play. I named it the pound of flesh dynamic. The idea being that as the price of acceptance, the price of entry into social circles that Jews thought of as natural, social justice circles, ones that had various causes for the good of society and humanity and justice, those causes and those circles that Jews were attracted to, that in many ways they have historically built, the price of entry increasingly became for Jews to hand over mostly a metaphorical pound of flesh. Unlike the way Shakespeare had it, it's not the Jews who demand the pound of flesh, it's rather the Jews who are demanded to hand over the pound of flesh. And what is the pound of flesh? The pound of flesh is a mutilation of one's Jewish identity, and it especially came in the context of Israel. So it used to be enough to say that you're for two states, or maybe that you hate Netanyahu and you oppose this government. But what happened is that once the pound of flesh was handed over, it never ended. There was always a demand to give more. And it became that the demand was to say things like Israel's an apartheid state, or Israel's committing genocide, or Israel was born in sin. And increasingly, these became a kind of exorcism ceremony where young Jews were expected to vocally display again and again the extent to which they have nothing, not only they have nothing to do with Israel, but that they are willing to say everything evil about it. And what I realized is that this dynamic was essentially the dynamic of bullying. When bullies ask for demand their lunch money, and you give over your lunch money, they don't go away. They come back the next day and they typically expect more. In the same way, the pound of flesh dynamic is one of bullying. When anti-Zionist bullying assaults students, Jewish students mostly, it never goes away. When the Jewish students give in, when they're willing to play into that dynamic, it doesn't go away. The bullies just keep asking for more. And what I realized in my connection with young students who became activists is that almost all of them at one point had an experience that was a bit like a T intersection. At one point, something visceral within them told them, this is never going to end, right? They began to understand that this dynamic of bullying was never going to end. There's no amount of pounds of flesh that would satisfy the bullies, except for all of it. The moment where Jews are no longer recognizable as Jews, or when they no longer exist. So what I found is that over time, students who viscerally felt that dynamic, and this is something that a student has to experience for themselves. I can explain it here, but in my experience, students only wake up to it as a matter of personal experience. Something happens that makes them realize that this was never a discussion about Israel, that this was not some good faith interaction trying to criticize aspects of Israeli policy. In fact, what they realized is that this had nothing to do with Israel. This was just a respectable mask by which an assault on Jews could take place in the places where Jews actually exist. Because in places where you find old style anti-Semitism, let's say in white supremacist circles, you actually don't have Jews. But in academia, in journalism, in social justice circles, Jews are overrepresented. And thereby, anti-Zionism became the respectable mask by which an assault on Jewish life could be mounted and still retain the mask of respectability that allowed it to exist in academic circles and journalistic circles, in circles where people would be offended to be told that they're anti-Semitic, but are proudly anti-Zionist. So what these students did when they arrived at this visceral T intersection, when they realized that the pound of flesh dynamic would never end, they realized that they face a choice. They can either hand over another pound of flesh, or they can step back and basically stand up to the bullies. And the very effective way of standing up to the bullies was basically for those students to proclaim themselves as Zionists. Zionism became, for those students, a shorthand, not to say that the Jewish people need a state, but rather to basically express confidence in their Jewish identity. What Zionism became is basically a shorthand for Jewish confidence. Because if you think about bullies prey on shame, on weakness. If you're ashamed of how you look, if you are ashamed of how you speak, if you're ashamed of your family background, it's easier to bully you. But when you express confidence, it's harder to bully you. So when Jewish students are saying, I'm a Zionist, the bullies are often so shocked by this expression of confidence that they go away. They actually don't know what to do at this point. And that's what I found in recent years, that Zionism has actually become just this short, effective way of telling the anti-Zionist bullies to go away. And this is why I called my recent collection of essays book, We Should All Be Zionists. Not just in the sense that I think Zionism is one of the most just causes in human history, the liberation of probably one of the world's longest persecuted, oppressed group, truly an inspirational story. So not only do I say that because I think this is a story that if it were not so purposefully maligned would serve as an inspiration for so many, but that this is actually the way for Jews around the world to express their Jewish identity, their confidence, and to stand up to the bullying dynamic of anti-Zionism and ultimately preserve their soul. Because anti-Zionism, this dynamic of bullying, ultimately takes an emotional toll. Zionism had an insight that was not shared by other groups. The idea that power corrupts is an insight of pretty much every ancient civilization, from Chinese to Persian to Western. But only the Jews, as the long-term powerless and literate people, were able to reach the realization that powerlessness also corrupts. That when you are constantly powerless, when other people decide your fate, whether you live or die, that also takes an emotional toll. So Zionism from the beginning was not just a movement of liberation, it was also a movement of healing. It was intended from the beginning to heal the Jewish condition, to allow Jews to resist those who wanted to do them ill and to stand up for themselves. And that's what I found that is still more than a century and a half later, the power of Zionism. It is the power to help people who are subjected to a dynamic of bullying and assault to basically stand up and say, nothing to look here, go away. I'm a confident Jew, so just go find other people to prey on. And this is why I've been saying for a few years now that in my experience, the only effective response to anti-Zionism is simply more Zionism.
So thank you so much, Dr. Wilf. We do have time for one question. We only have a couple minutes. And the question is, how should we speak about Zionism during this war? Should we speak about Zionism differently when speaking about it with our children and grandchildren versus our general group of, let's say, mishpacha? So how should we address it, or should we address it differently during the war?
Absolutely not. We should always address it in the same way. This is a liberation movement that has always sought nothing but dignity and equality for the Jewish people as individuals and as a collective. It had the insight that the Jews will be treated as equals, even when they don't live in a state of the Jewish people, merely by the fact that there is a state, that someone has their back. I don't think it's a coincidence that the fact that Jews have been treated as equals in the countries where they live now happens to also coincide with the existence of the state of Israel. I certainly have no intention to test the alternative hypotheses, but we really need to understand why Zionism has been made into a toxic word. It's not ever because of what Israel did, even though people want you to think that. The process by which Zionism has been made into a toxic word has been deliberate and sinister. It's something that I've come to call the placard strategy, because you see it on, even now, on anti-Israel placards and anti-Israel demonstrations, but it's also on social media and regular media and the United Nations. It's those placards that have Zionism written on them, or Israel, or sometimes they just draw the Star of David, and then an equation sign. And the placard strategy has been in existence for decades. It was actually hatched by the Soviet Union in the 60s. And it's been so effective that you all know what's on the other side of the equation. Zionism equals racism, colonialism, apartheid, Nazism, genocide, white supremacy. All these words are attached to Zionism, not because they reflect anything having to do with reality. You only need to know a little bit to know how much of a lie that is. Those words are chosen because they are understood as evil. So the placard strategy has been in effect for decades to create a refrain in people's minds that Israel, Zionism, the Star of David equal evil. And we need to not play into that. When people make claims about Zionism, colonialism, racism, genocide, don't engage with it. These are not good faith discussions about Israeli actions. Those are part of a deliberate and sinister strategy, even if the person themselves employing it is not aware of it, to create a global mindset by which it is globally understood that Israel and Zionism are evil. And the reason we've seen an explosion of that since October 7th is that once you create the global mindset that Israel and Zionism equate evil, then when Jews are being butchered in their own homes, you have many people who have been trained and groomed to respond to that with, they had it coming because they're evil. And we need to understand it for what it is. So we need to teach Zionism as what it is, as the liberation movement of the Jewish people. And we need to teach anti-Zionism for what it is, as a sinister ideology that gives the mask of respectability for an assault on Jewish life.